Mothers are usually loving, nurturing, and caring, but that isn't always the case in movies, especially when it comes to my favorite genre, horror. There was a time in horror cinema when a mother that simply wanted to work outside the home was blamed for the horrific things that happened to her children. For example, in the movie The Exorcist, it's implied that Reagan's mother, Chris, was responsible for her daughter becoming possessed. The reason? Because Chris decided to focus on her career. With The Shining, Stephen King said in 2013 in an interview with the BBC that Shelley Duvall's portrayal of Wendy Torrance was one of the most misogynistic characters that was ever put on screen, and that she was basically just there to scream and be stupid, and he said that wasn't the woman that he wrote about. Who was the killer in the original Friday the 13th? This question was asked in one of the most thrillingly terrifying opening scenes in a horror movie in decades.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
No, it's not! No, it's not! It was Jason!
Afraid not? No way.
Listen, it was Jason! I saw that movie 20 damn time!
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel. I'm afraid that was a wrong answer.
The initial killing spree at Camp Crystal Lake was carried out by Jason's mother, Mrs. Pamela Voorhees, played by Betsy Palmer. She became known as the proverbial mother of horror. She spoke about her process as an actor. She said, "Being an actress who uses the Stanislavski method, I always try to find details about my character. I began with a class ring that I remember reading in the script that she had worn. Starting with that, I traced Pamela back to my old high school days in the early 40s. So it's 1944, a very conservative time, and Pamela had a steady boyfriend. She said they have sex, which is very bad, of course, and Pamela soon gets pregnant with Jason. The father takes off, and when Pamela tells her parents, they disown her because having children out of wedlock isn't something that good girls do. I think she took Jason and raised him the best she could, but he turned out to be a very strange boy. She took lots of odd jobs, and one of those jobs was as a cook at a summer camp. Then Jason drowns and her whole world collapses. What were the counselors doing instead of watching Jason? They were having sex, which is the way that she got into trouble. So from that point on, Pamela became very psychotic and puritanical in her attitudes, as she was determined to kill all of the immoral camp counselors.
Kill her, Mommy! Kill her!
With one simple line, Betsy Palmer carved her way into horror history. Getting back to the movie, Jason's mother had him when she was 16. He didn't attend school because of his condition, and she was very protective of him because he was born with hydrocephalus, or water on the brain, and he was picked on and bullied by the other boys. Now, Mrs. Voorhees worked as a camp cook, so she expected the counselors to watch Jason, but they were young and full of hormones. Now, one night, Jason goes swimming even though he wasn't a good swimmer, and because the counselors were busy ravaging each other, they didn't see him. It was believed that Jason drowned that day in the lake in 1957. In 1958, a year after his presumed death, Mrs. Voorhees isn't doing too well mentally and is being driven by pain and revenge, so she murders two counselors while they too were ravaging each other. Sex equaled death. The camp, nicknamed Camp Blood, was closed down for years because of the deaths. It had a death curse. Ralph tried to warn everybody.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?
Leave people alone!
You'll never come back again.
Oh, shut up, Ralph.
It's got a death curse.
Now, 21 years later, someone buys the lake and they plan to reopen the camp. Mrs. Voorhees did everything that she could think of to prevent the camp from reopening, but it didn't work. She did something to the water in 1962, and she even burned down some of the cabins, but her actions did not prevent the camp from opening, and in 1980, Camp Crystal Lake opened for business. Because of this, Mrs. Voorhees killed every single person at that camp except for Alice. She was later decapitated by Alice with her own machete, and things seemed okay again until the very end. Jason saw Alice kill his mother, and this caused him to go insane. He grabbed his mother's machete, her locket, her head, and her sweater, and he created a shrine in his lonely shack, and an integral piece of horror history was born. With Scream 2, you have a mother, Nancy Loomis, following in the footsteps of her killer's son, Billy. We learn about her in the first Scream when Billy mentioned how she abandoned him once she found out that her husband was having an affair with Maureen Prescott, Sidney's mother. She later regretted leaving the family once she learned that Billy had become one of 2 serial killers that were responsible for the 1996 Woodsboro murders. To avoid being recognized in Woodsboro, she lost 60 pounds, she had plastic surgery, and she created a new identity. She became Debbie Salt and pretended to be a journalist, just like Gail Weathers, who she claimed to admire. She, along with Mickey, became the newest masked killers known as Ghostface. Nancy's main focus was finding and killing Sidney and Gail Weathers. She wanted revenge against Sidney for killing Billy, and she felt that Gail exploited her grief by writing the book The Woodsboro Murders. The book told the story of the crimes that involved her son and his friend Stu, and it inspired the Stab movies. Unfortunately, this is the only picture that we have of Norma Bates, Norman Bates' mother in the original Psycho. She was assumed to be the killer even though we didn't see her until a very pivotal scene in the movie, and she was no longer alive.
Mrs. Bates.
That particular scene has been described as one of the best, most terrifying, and most famous twist endings of all time. In the book and the movie, it's said that after the death of her husband, she didn't want Norman to leave her, so she taught him that all sexual intercourse was sinful, even inside of marriage, and that all women, except for herself, were whores. The book also hints at their relationship maybe being incestuous, and for most of his life, she was the only woman that he was exposed to on a regular basis. She was the woman in his life. Norma was very clingy, controlling, and was emotionally abusive to Norman. When he was a teenager, she met a man named Joe who encouraged her to sell her farm and build a motel in Fairville, California, on the land between the family home and the highway. But when a new highway opened, the number of visitors to the Bates Motel drastically decreased. Later, when she tells Norman that she's marrying Joe, he became insanely jealous and he poisoned them both with strychnine, making it look like a murder-suicide. He eventually removed Norma's body from her grave in Green Lawn Cemetery and had a weighted coffin buried instead. But even in death, Norma had control over her son. He would pretend that she was still alive and even held two-way conversations with her.
Mother, she's just a stranger. She's hungry and it's raining out.
Mother, she's just a stranger. As if men don't desire strangers. As if... Oh, I refuse to speak of disgusting things because they disgust me. You understand, boy? Go on, go tell her she'll not be appeasing her ugly appetite with my food or my son. Or do I have to tell her because you don't have the guts? Huh, boy? You have the guts, boy?
Shut up! Shut up!
At the end of the movie, we learn about Norman's mental state and how he had essentially become two people in one body. He developed multiple personality disorder, or what is now known as dissociative identity disorder, after he killed his mother and her husband 10 years earlier. When the mother persona presented itself, Norman wasn't simply putting on her clothes and killing people. He actually believed that he was his mother. Whenever a woman would check into the motel, his attraction to them brought the Norma part of his personality out. He would suddenly become dominant and he would wear her clothes as he killed the women. He would then toss their bodies into a nearby swamp. Now, years later, Norma's body was removed from the home and buried in the cemetery. 22 years later, in Psycho 2, her body was exhumed to prove to Norman that his mother was indeed dead. In the summer of 1959, Margaret Brigham's father was killed in a shooting incident, and to cope with the loss, she began going to fundamentalist prayer meetings, and she became terrifyingly fanatical. It's been said that she may have suffered from untreated schizophrenia that worsened as she got older. Similar to Norma Bates, Margaret believed almost everything was a sin, especially if it had to do with female sexuality or intercourse. When her mother remarried a man named Harold Allison, Margaret was furious because she believed they were living in sin. Christian fundamentalists believe that getting remarried is committing adultery. So even though she didn't agree with her mother's new marriage, she refused to leave home until 1960, which is when she met a man named Ralph White and moved in with him. That's cohabitation, so I'm surprised she was okay with that. Ralph eventually cheated on Margaret, and he promised that it would never happen again. In February of 1963, 7 months before Carrie was born, Ralph was killed while working on a construction site. Margaret would give birth to Carrie at home all by herself on September 21st, 1963. Later, Margaret tells Carrie that she sinned because she had sex with Ralph before marriage. She said she wanted to end her life afterwards, and she fell down the stairs to try to induce a miscarriage. On August 17, 1966, stones would fall from the sky, which were brought on by Carrie's telekinetic power after her mother punished her. Margaret would then denounce Carrie as a witch.
Things are gonna change around here.
Her mental illness prevented her from loving Carrie in a positive motherly way, and she occasionally would have wild fits and tantrums when she caught Carrie doing something that she considered a sin, which was basically anything that didn't have to do with the Bible. Whenever Margaret believed that Carrie had sinned at school, she would throw her in a closet to pray for forgiveness and would leave her in there for several hours, sometimes days.
Yes? Thank you. I know you're listening. Come on downstairs.
Who was that? Cough.
She believed that only loose women developed breasts, or dirty pillows, as she called them. When Carrie started her period at 16, Margaret referred to it as the curse of blood and said that it was brought on by some sort of sexual sin that Carrie had committed. When Carrie is asked to go to the Bates High School prom by Tommy Ross, Margaret is initially against it, but Carrie desperately needed this to fit in, so she used her telekinetic power to control her mother.
I can see your dirty pillows. Everyone will.
Breasts, Mama. They're called breasts, and every woman has them.
Take off that dress.
No.
We'll burn it together and pray for forgiveness.
No, Mama. Stop it, Mama! Stop hurting yourself, Mama!
He's gonna laugh at you. They're all gonna laugh at you.
You can stay here with me. I don't want to stay with you, Mama. Sit down and be quiet!
While waiting for Carrie to come home from the prom, Margaret decides to, quote-unquote, kill the sin, so she hides a butcher knife in her dress. Now, back at the prom, Carrie was pranked with a bucket of pig's blood as she accepted the prize for prom queen. Afterwards, she walks home covered in blood and takes a bath.
After the first time, before we were married, Ralph promised never again, and I believed him. The sin never dies. At first, it was all right. We lived sinlessly. We slept in the same bed, but we never did. And then, that night, I smelled the whiskey on his breath. And he took me. The stink of the roadhouse whiskey on his breath. And I liked it. I liked you. I should have given you to God when you were born. But now, the devil is come home. We'll pray. Yes. For the last time, we'll pray. My Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done.
Carrie sends knives flying towards her mother, which kill her. She then destroys the house and dies. As the movie Hereditary opens, we see the obituary of Ellen Lee. She was 78. Her death puts into motion the tragic events that are to follow. Ellen was Annie Graham's mother, and she had dissociative identity disorder and later in life dementia, so she moved in with Annie and her family. Ellen was married to Martin Lee, and they had 2 children, Charles and Annie. Both Annie's father, Martin, and her brother, Charles, passed away sometime before the start of the movie. Next, we see a room that is filled with miniatures. Annie works from home making dioramas and miniatures for an art gallery, and she enjoys making miniatures of things and events that are important to her. They tend to depict traumatic events in her life that she hasn't been able to deal with. The camera then zooms into a miniature replica of the family's beautifully massive home, and we see the son Peter in bed. This scene lets us know that someone or something is watching this family, not just the audience. Annie and her mother had a rocky relationship, and it's made very obvious during the funeral when she gave the eulogy. She said, "My mother was a secretive and private woman. She had private rituals, private friends, private anxieties." She didn't speak of her mother in glowing terms, but she did love her. Their estranged relationship improved when Annie was pregnant with Charlie because Ellen became involved in raising her. Ellen wanted Charlie to be a boy. Annie also admitted to basically giving her to Ellen. However, Ellen had ulterior motives, which I'll talk about soon. We now see how closed off from one another the family is because they each stay in their rooms, and when we do see them together, the scene is usually filled with tension so thick that we can feel it through the screen.
You okay, Mom?
So, unfortunately, when creepy things start to happen, the family doesn't talk to one another about those things, so they aren't even aware that the other person is experiencing anything strange. I really like the way The Hollywood Reporter describes this movie. You can read Hereditary as a painful drama about a family that is completely torn apart after its teenage son Peter accidentally kills his sister Charlie, traumatizing his mother Annie. Or you can view Hereditary as a straight-up horror film about a family that had been doomed by their occultist grandma years before the movie's events. During one of the most shocking scenes in horror history, Peter is invited to a party and Annie makes him take Charlie with her. He ends up leaving her downstairs with drunk partying teenagers so that he can get high with his friends and a girl that he likes. So Charlie is offered a chocolate cake, but she doesn't know that it has nuts in it. Charlie is allergic to nuts, so she has a severe allergic reaction and goes into anaphylactic shock. She finds Peter and lets him know that it feels like her throat is closing up. As Peter drives her to the hospital, he's going about 80 miles per hour, and he swerves to hit a deer that's in the road.
Charlie!
Peter drives his sister's headless body back home, leaves her body in the backseat of his parents' car, and goes to his room. Charlie's head was still on the side of the highway, with bugs crawling all over it. His mother sees the body the next morning, and of course she absolutely loses her mind. All of this caused Peter to be severely mentally damaged, plus Annie blames him for Charlie's death and resents him for it. Eventually, she creates a miniature version of the scene of Charlie's death, blood, head, and all. She eventually starts going to a support group to cope with the loss, where she meets a woman named Joan. Joan convinced her to participate in a seance, and she helps her speak to Charlie in the afterlife. Annie thought that the words that she spoke were summoning Charlie, when they were actually summoning a demon. During a sleepwalking episode, Annie revealed that she never wanted to be Peter's mother, but quickly explains how much she loves him now. Several years before the start of the film, Annie tried to set Peter on fire while he was sleeping. She blamed it on sleepwalking, but he didn't buy it, and their relationship was strained from then on. Annie had a brother that took his life in Ellen's bedroom when he was 16.
My father died when I was a baby from starvation because he had psychotic depression, and he starved himself, which I'm sure was just as pleasant as it sounds. And then there's my brother. My older brother had schizophrenia, and when he was 16, he hanged himself in my mother's bedroom, and of course his suicide note blamed her, accusing her of putting people inside him.
It's not explicitly spelled out, but it is hinted to that Martin's death was not because of depression, but it was a way to keep Ellen from using his body as a vessel. Starving himself caused his body to be malnourished and weak, which made him an unsuitable host for payment. It's likely that after Martin's death, Ellen attempted to use Charles' body as a vessel. Very soon after Charlie was born, Payman took over. The cult had been trying to summon him for years, but Charlie was their first successful host. Her grandmother, Ellen, was a witch and the leader of the cult of Payman. She was known as Queen Lee. So who is Payman? I've also heard the name pronounced Paimon, but I'll just say Payman.
King Paimon is really good at helping you to reach spiritual awakening. He also teaches you secret knowledge. So if you are somebody that loves mysteries, that he just throws this type of information into your lap. Most of his secret knowledge comes through dreams. Okay, he helps with creativity as well as art forms. He binds people to you. So if you're working in an environment and you feel like there's a few people that disrespects you, he can help you and bind them to you so they listen to almost everything that you have to say. You get put on that pedestal and they are binded and they cannot help but give in to you. He helps you when it comes to invoking other demons. He can open you up enough to hear them. And if you have any forms of money problems in your life, King Paimon is brilliant with this. He will open doors of finances, money opportunities, growth, prosperity. King Paimon will help you in this area of your life.
Payman is the 9th spirit in the Goetia and is one of Lucifer's most obedient devotees. He was first mentioned in a grimoire from the mid-1600s called the Lesser Key of Solomon, a book on sorcery, mysticism, and magic. He is ranked as a king among spirits in most literature and is in command of several legions. He's described as a man riding a camel and is accompanied by men playing loud music like trumpets and cymbals, and he can reanimate the dead for several years. We unknowingly see the gold sigil of Payman on Ellen's necklace and the telephone pole that Charlie hits. When Annie becomes possessed, and while under Payman's control, she saws her head off. Because of Peter's depression and mental anguish, he's able to now be taken advantage of and inhabited by Payman. Ellen promised Peter to Payman, so he is ready to collect. The cult's goal is to have a young male host to put Payment into. So Ellen probably only had children so that she could summon Payment and have a vessel for him. Because of this, Annie was unloved, she was neglected and abused, and it's how she learned to interact with her own children. It's a cycle. It's heavily implied that Joan's grandson died as a result of the cult trying to use him for their ritual. And at the end, Peter is targeted by his mother after she is possessed by Payment, and after seeing her saw her own head off. He jumps out of the attic window. The fall weakens him just enough for Payment to take over his body.